welcome all those who are joining us on live stream from their home. We're launching this evening a series of lectures and programs, commemorations that will lead us and actually will take us even past Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day, 76 years since Israel's independence. And this is a very, I don't have to tell you, very painful, difficult, tragic year. And there's a lot of questions that just came to the surface on October 7th and its aftermath. A lot of questions, a lot of uncertainties, a lot of challenges as Israel now approaches its 76th year. And so we've decided to have a series of presentations over the course of the next few months just to deal with these very complicated questions in this very painful moment. And a few months ago, Felicia and I were contacted by Gilad Halpern and his colleague Olga Kirschbaum from the Tel Aviv Review of Books, and suggested that we might try some programs together, some discussions together that would bring contributors to the Tel Aviv Review of Books and other people to engage in conversations, sometimes or disagreements, about how people see the current situation and what's unfolding. So we were very, very happy, and this is the first program that we're doing together with Tel Aviv Review of Books, so thank you Gilad and Olga. We look forward to more. So just to say that also with a lot of gratitude to Helena Glass, whose generosity makes possible also this series of Israel at 76 in memory of her beloved parents, Regina and Carl, and in honor of Yom HaAtzmaut 5784. So thank you so much, Elena. And with this, I'm going to introduce Gilad. He's going to introduce the Clemence and Oren on the panel. Gilad is an Israeli journalist, broadcaster, and media historian who's completing his PhD. Maybe he'll tell us a little bit about it. He's a co-host of the English language podcast, the Tel Aviv Review, and founding co-editor of the Tel Aviv Review of Books, an English language literary journal, and you can help yourself to a copy. And this journal was founded just before COVID, and we're happy that once again that you're here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roli. Thank you all for coming. Yes, I'm going to say before I introduce my eminent co-panelists, I'm going to say a few words about the Tel Aviv Review of Books. So it's an online English language literary journal that is, despite its language, entirely Israeli. So it's basically a window into the Israeli world of letters in the broadest terms possible. So we have book reviews, and we have essays, and we have original fiction and poetry and literary criticism. And the idea came up when a few of us, we are a team of 5 or 6 co-founders, coming from different walks of life, journalists and academics and literary editors, and even an award-winning novelist, Maya Neitan, who won the National Jewish Book Award last year for her novel Love. And we all came together and thought that there's a lot in English about Israel, but of two different types that, in our opinion, miss the point. One is the daily newspapers, like news media, of which there are many. I mean, plenty of titles that you're probably all familiar with: Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, the Times of Israel, and many others. and I, coming from the newsrooms of some of these media outlets where I cut my teeth some years ago, know them inside out. And the thing is that it's all very much almost always on the surface. There's hardly, in the very rushed media landscape of today, there's hardly any room for an in-depth discussion. And the other type is there's a lot of academic research into what's now called Israel studies. There are academic journals, but these are written for academics and hardly for the general audience. So there was this gap that we wanted to fill, and the Tel Aviv Review of Books was meant for that. Another thing that we hold dear is really a variety of opinions, not just as a lip service, but really we have just recently a review of Richard Landy's book. I don't know if you know who he is a scholar of Islam that some I would say borderline Islamophobic, and alongside just a very recent essay of a British Jew who volunteered with a group of anti-Zionist Jews in the West Bank, protecting Palestinians from settler violence. So these are really live side by side on a website, and we're happy with it and would like to maintain it. So these are the really two things that keep us going. As Rowley said, we have a limited print edition of some of our best of stories waiting for you there. It's for new subscribers. If you open it, there's a QR code. You can subscribe and have a copy, and hopefully you will continue to support our work. So thanks for that. And now I would like to introduce the panelists. Oh, the cards. Yeah. Okay. To my left is Professor Clémence Boulouk. She is a professor of Israel and Jewish Studies at Columbia University and a longtime friend of the Tel Aviv Review of Books. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this, Clémence. Thank you for joining us. And Oren Kessler, who is a former colleague of mine, an American-Israeli journalist, formerly with the Jerusalem Post and Haaretz, and his award-winning book, who's also that's also on that table over there and in Clémence's hands, is Palestine 1936, The Great Revolt and the Roots of the Middle East Conflict. It was published last year by Rowman and Littlefield, and he's also formerly research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the Henry Jackson Society. Now, I'm very happy to have these two speakers here tonight because this is exactly what we're looking for. You know, an in-depth, perhaps scholarly or research-based insight into the current events. So, Clémence, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Gilad. I'm delighted to be here tonight. I absolutely adored Oren's book, so it's a real pleasure to be able to be in conversation with both of you. I'll be the moderator, and I would really love to hear your perspectives on how to understand the shades of gray and the multiple shades of Israel in a world in which things seem to be oversimplified from all sides have a vested interest in simplifying what is utterly complicated. So for a little bit of background, I'm a recovering journalist, so I feel like that this is my tribe also. I worked for a few years in France, and I covered foreign fiction, and I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time with Amos Oz, David Grossman, and I remember in 2008 the guest of honor of the French Book Fair was Israel. I don't see how that would happen today. There was only one bomb alert, and we had to evacuate once, but things have changed dramatically. But going back to this, to Amos Oz sort of presence here, I remember when he was talking about, I mean, what he described about Israel is that the difficulty is that every single cab driver is a prophet and also an exegete of current events. And so that makes it difficult for any government to actually govern and lead over a nation of prophets. So, and sometimes that can be cacophony or, you know, a lot of tumult. So how do you manage to actually report or like help sort of cut through the noise when there is, you know, in and of itself a nation of exegetes? And so that would be my first question.
Yeah, I'll take it. Yeah, there's a lot of noise, not just people, but actually you feel it. I think that the only place where I feel more overwhelmed by the hustle and bustle than Israel is New York. There's the thing about Israelis, as you probably know, is that every Israeli thinks is reinvented the wheel. This is really the
driving well for a camera.
This is really the dark side of innovation, right? The startup nation, right? Everyone comes up with this brilliant idea that they think is it was suggested for the first time, but at the same time, it stems from an infrastructure that I think has kept us together and is the reason why I still believe there's a bright future for Israel. And that is that there is a great deal of solidarity between Israelis that's evolved over the years and has become much less tribal, which is what it used to be, like, you know, Jews clinging together. And I think that the notion of, like, a civic consciousness is something that has developed greatly in Israel over the last few years, I'd say even decades by now. And you can see that in many, many ways. For me, the most hopeful ones are really the great integration. There's still a long way to go, but a great degree of integration of, you know, either Israeli Arabs or Palestinian citizens of Israel, either way you want to call them. I think that what really fills me with much hope for Israel is every time, and it's happened a few times, that I see a veiled Muslim woman driving a bus in Tel Aviv. And that's happened. I mean, they're there. And you see them, they're much more visible on university campuses than before. And that fills me with a great deal of hope. And the other thing is what we saw this past year, just up until the 7th of October. And that is the absolutely hair-raising mobilization that that swept the Israeli citizenry with unprecedented protests to save Israeli democracy. At least that's what they were saying, and in many ways they were standing up to the government. And all that created all sorts of groups and organizations that later, after the 7th of October, were very much ready to deploy their solidarity and their infrastructure in order to help people who were affected by it. Achim Laneshek is one, I forget what they're called in English. Judy, what are they called in English? Brothers and Sisters in Arms. For example, so it's an entirely civilian, completely grassroots organization that came to the fore to help, first of all, to defend Israeli democracy and protest against the judicial overhaul, but also now, since the 7th of October, for 6 months now, some of them have been hard at work helping people in need. So there's really that thing that I think that we should really concentrate on.
Arne?
Well, I'm going to do the least Israeli thing possible and say I have nothing to add, nothing to disagree with. I think Gilad answered that beautifully, so I'll just wait for the second question.
All right. Not in the spirit of Amos's cab drivers, but well, thank you. So, well, I think you'll have something to say about this because this is from your book. The book opens with this sentence: "A certain grim but familiar pattern typifies reports from the Holy Land." So we're trying to do something different tonight. I'm sorry that we don't have breaking news that would bring up a lot of hope. But how does one break this pattern? I mean, by writing this book, for sure. But how does one sort of find themselves in that environment and trying to come up with a different narrative than the military or political strategic sort of trifecta or trinity that usually characterizes the reports about Israel? Sure.
Well, thank you so much to Bnei Yeshurun and to Tel Aviv Review and Gilad and you, Clemence, Rabbi Matalon. It's great to be here in these beautiful surroundings. I think later on in the evening we can talk a bit more about what the book is about. But there's a lot of death and destruction and grimness in this book, but I think there are multiple points in this book, in this period I'm writing about, in which things could have gone differently, in which there was a crossroads at which things could have ended up differently, that we weren't destined, we weren't fated to this just apparently impassable sort of quagmire. And I think that the fact that things could have gone differently in the past suggests that they still can now, today, and tomorrow. One of the key characters in my book, the book is about the great Arab revolt of 1936 to 39. So inevitably, one of the main characters is the notorious Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti. And so one of the sort of perhaps the primordial what if, for example, is what if the British, in their infinite wisdom, had perhaps appointed somebody else to be the leader of the Arabs of Palestine. And there are so many points at which Arab leadership could have made different decisions. The Jewish leadership could have made different decisions. And so even in these very dark times, I think that gives me just a little bit of hope.
Gilad?
Yeah, I think that there are two ways to look at the conflict from 1936, at least, if not before, until today, so almost 90 years. And that is that we are always stuck in the same point, right? That it's repeating itself. History may not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes, as Mark Twain said. And I think that this is a great reason to be in despair, because we've tried it so many times and it's the same result over and over again. But at the same time, I think that it's because we haven't really tried, or not tried enough, the most natural and inevitable solution, which is to try and live together to the best extent possible. And we're seeing this, sadly, I think that the problem is, if you look at it historically, there are two trajectories that are not overlapping: the Palestinian trajectory and the Jewish trajectory. Jewish Zionist Israeli, according to the period you're talking about. And that is that the Palestinians have, by and large, again, not to the best extent, but have been undergoing a process of moderation over the years. I mean, I'm talking about the leadership, right? The official representative leadership, which is the PLO and the Palestinian Authority. Hamas is a separate issue that we can touch upon because it's interesting in its own way. But I want to focus on the representative leadership, which is the PA. So today, if you look at Mahmoud Abbas, even though he's a very difficult partner, there are a lot less rejectionist and maximalists than what the Palestinians were in 1936 and 1948, rejecting everything out of hand. And at the same time, the Israelis have gone, again, not in absolute terms, but in a different direction. The current government, the current leadership now, is the most rejectionist and extremist the Zionist movement has probably ever seen. And I think that what good leadership could do and should do with a historical view is try to reconcile these two trajectories and sort of try and bring them together. It happened briefly, and again, it failed miserably in the 1990s, that we had this bout, actually all over the world in the post-Soviet era, this period beaming with optimism that everyone was becoming a liberal, liberal democracies all of a sudden, and I'm actually convinced that that moment could return, and it's the role of the leadership, both at home, the two peoples, and of course the international community, that could bring us there.
I want to return. I'm going to actually use the book a little bit as a thread, if you will.
Please do.
I'd like to return to the argument of the book, which is this has been an event that is both formative and that was also overshadowed because it doesn't fit nicely or squarely with the narratives, the national narratives of either Israel or Palestine. And so I'd like to ask you to elaborate on this a little bit, and also, and this is also for Gilad since you haven't written the book, but how are those narratives? I mean, Pesach's coming up. We know that narratives and stories shape identities. So how do you see the work ahead in terms of not being revisionist, but thinking about the narrative that have shaped Israeli identity?
Yeah, and I think this is my book is really, again, about sort of the first Palestinian or Palestinian-Arab intifada, really. And very often when I start talking about my book, people ask me, "Oh, you mean Hebron? You mean the Hebron riots of 1929?" And essentially, yes, there were bouts of violence before 1936. There was violence in 1920. In Nabi Musa in Jerusalem in 1921 in Jaffa, and then infamously in Hebron in 1929, in which 133 Jews were killed in very grim and gruesome fashion in ways that really recall the atrocities of October 7th. But kind of what I argue is that this is really, those were bouts of terrorism, of violence, of riots, but they did not represent a sustained sort of nationalist Arab uprising. The first time we see anything like that, the first time we see really an intifada in the parlance of today is this period. And so in terms of sort of narrative, as you asked, I think there is a question about why this period has been so forgotten by both sides, really. And I think what I write in the book is that I think for Israelis, the sort of the Zionist story is a forward-moving tale. It's a positive tale. It's a story of self-determination, of statehood for the stateless, a home for the homeless. And I think a large-scale, concerted nationalist uprising against that forward-moving tale is a rather unwelcome sort of blip in the narrative arc. That's my theory for why this has been so kind of overshadowed in the Israeli consciousness. And then in the Palestinian consciousness, the Nakba, the Palestinian defeat and dispersal of 1947, 48, 49 is so central to the Palestinian narrative. And it's really much easier, quote unquote, to focus on that as a Palestinian, I think. And I'm channeling here the Palestinian-Israeli professor Mustafa Kabha, who I quote in the book. He's with the Open University of Israel. And he really writes that it's much, again, easier, more comfortable, as it were, for Palestinians to focus on the Nakba, on 47, 48, because in their view, they were victimized. They were victimized certainly by the Jews, by their fellow Arabs who failed to rescue them from the Zionist menace in their view, from European imperialism for this whole crazy mandate adventure in the first place, for the Balfour Declaration. And so, whereas dealing with 1936 to 39 requires a lot more soul searching. Again, these are Professor Kabha's words, because the initial unity of this revolt that I write about, under the ostensible leadership of the Mufti, the initial unity of Palestinian Arab society just kind of dissolves and explodes by the end of the revolt. In sort of the last year and a half of the revolt, you just see a massive amount of Arabs killing Arabs, to the extent that probably by the end of this revolt, more Arabs have been killed by Arabs than even by British forces or Jews. And so I think that causes maybe perhaps a certain cognitive dissonance in the Palestinian narrative, which has led it to this era to be really kind of forgotten.
Gilad?
Yeah, I think it was Edward Said who said, no, it might not have been him, I forget who it was, who said that about 1967, about the Six-Day War, that the problem with it, that it was too much of a victory for Israel and too much of a defeat for the Palestinians. That the chasm was so great that it took them a long time to come to terms with it and try to bridge that gap. And I think that if you just zoom out a bit from it and look at the history of both the Israelis and the Palestinians, the history of Israel is, well, in Israel proper, right? We'll put the history of the Jewish people aside for a second, but in Israel proper, it's beaming with victories, almost one after the other. And for the Palestinians, it's beaming with defeats. Now, you would think that such a decisive disparity would call the shots indefinitely, but it actually, 1967, just only reignited the Palestinian struggle in a way. And if you look at it in this way, the 7th of October is, for Israel, it's a defeat of unprecedented magnitude. It undercuts so many of the basic assumptions that Israelis had about the country, about Zionism, about sovereignty, right? The one competitive edge of a Jewish state is that Jewish grannies would no longer be able to be snatched from the beds by people who want to kill them, and that's exactly what happened on the 7th of October. So it is, you know, putting the great tragedy outside and the very understandable feelings of vengefulness and, you know, hopelessness, I think it could well be a sobering moment for Israel, in the sense that it would recognize the limits of its own power. Now, the question remains whether that would lead to a solution that's more conducive to coexistence, the same way that the Yom Kippur War did vis-a-vis Egypt, you know, just 5 or 6 years after an event of similar proportions to the 7th of October, except that it was a military conflict rather than a terrorist attack on civilians, but it hit a soft spot in a similar way. So just 5 or 6 years afterwards, what I would say the greatest strategic asset that Israel has had, the peace accord with Egypt, was signed. It could go that way. On the other hand, it could also rekindle all sorts of, or just incentivize very dark forces that may see it as an opportunity. So, you know, radical Islamism, wherever it is, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or other groups around us, and of course Iran. So I think, again, it needs a great deal of leadership here to try, because what's really politics and diplomacy? It's trying to shape reality according to your strategic and long-term needs. And I think this is, of course, where Netanyahu failed so miserably, but hopefully later on, with the new leadership, Israel will be able to shape reality in a way that would be more fitting to the first option rather than the latter.
You mentioned 1967 writers like David Grossman, or, you know, what I used to call the Holy Trinity, you know, Yehoshua and Amos Oz. I mean, two of them unfortunately are no longer with us. But David Grossman talked about the way in which this victory was actually was going to sort of eat up Israel's soul. And so one of the questions that I have for you, and then I'll return to the book, is who are the voices now, and are writers actually, have they taken this kind of moral stance, or even maybe sometimes super ego of the nation, now that two of them are gone? David Grossman, is also dealing with his share of grief after having lost his son, Uri. So who is playing in that cacophony, and obviously this grief and this mourning? Is there a voice that emerges?
Yeah.
Or
first
are
of
they
all, I have start with a general comment, and that is that I wouldn't romanticize this troika to that extent. I think that they were all very good writers in their own way, and of course I always admire people who weigh in on politics in this way. But I think, sitting here in New York and talking to a non-Israeli audience, I think that they were much bigger abroad than they were actually in Israel. And it applies to a lot of other people. I can think of Shimon Peres, for example, who was a lot bigger abroad than he was ever in Israel. Is this better? Right, is now better? Yeah? Okay, I'll try to talk into the mic. Is this better? Okay. So I don't think Grossman and Oz and Yehoshua were that big in Israel. They were a lot bigger in America and in the world than they were
in the diaspora.
In the diaspora, yeah, because they were. I think that this is really one of the differences between diaspora and Israel. That diaspora Jews in general are much more preoccupied with ideas and creed than Israel. I mean, it's part of Zionism was to. It was a very tachlis sort of movement, right? Create facts on the ground, and that's about it. Of course, there was education involved in it and all that, but the world of ideas is essentially foreign to them.
You might want to translate tachlis. I'm not sure everybody.
Yeah, I don't really know how to translate that. It's like a very practical.
It's to the point.
Practical,
yeah.
to the point. Yeah.
Mundane.
Yeah. So I think, but also there's there has been, and this is my analysis as a journalist, there has been a great variety. I mean, the fact that Grossman and Oz and other people, not just them, but received that privileged status that they had was because there were a lot fewer channels to express yourself in the public scene. So only a very limited amount of people could do that then. And now, I mean, of course, I could go on for hours talking about all the adverse effects of social media and that, but there's plenty of voices that are being heard now, and we gave a platform to some of them in the Tel Aviv Review of Books. For example, there are groups of Mizrahi intellectuals, descendants of immigrants from the Middle East, Mizrahi Sephardi Jews who came to Israel and were the underclass for a long time. And in recent years, some very impressive intellectuals have emerged from that scene. Another very interesting group that we also have covered in the Tel Aviv Review of Books is the so-called faithful left, the group of religious people who, unlike the great majority of their community, define themselves as leftists. So they are really grappling with ideas that are pretty foreign to many Orthodox, religious in Israel is mainly Orthodox people, and their more liberal, progressive, dovish views about politics. So really, and also another group that we gave a platform to is again descendants, second generation Russian immigrants, also generally looked upon as a monolithic and homogeneous group, right wing. Yeah, and it's a lot more diverse than people may think. And these really are the voices that are really the voices to look out to, and we're trying to convey that on the pages of the Tel Aviv Review of Books.
That was the hidden agenda of my question. And that's the sort of, is there anything that you'd like to add to this, or you like how? Again,
Gilad nailed it. Beautiful, beautiful.
So since we're speaking about voices and really elevating some of them, your book...
Oh, Clemence, sorry, I just want to say, I didn't say anything about the cards. I'm sorry. You have cards on your seats. If you want to ask questions, please write them on the cards and hand them over to us at some point, to Felicia or Roli. Sorry, carry on.
So adding to the voices, adding the voices of the audience. So your book is structured, I mean, you're giving voice to a number of figures, or fascinating, or obviously the Mufti, but many other characters. So beyond the literary device of like how does one write a book that is like a kaleidoscope, do you think it was also important in almost like an ethical way to, like again, give voice to or have elevate the point of view of those who, it is an forgotten event, so like you had to make sure that the voices were heard.
I think, it is a work of history, but I really do. I think the resonances from that period and from today are just remarkable, and it's quite mind-boggling when you think that this is a period. This was 10 years before there was a state of Israel, and yet so many of the dynamics from this period, from the late British Mandate, are nearly identical to today. Where do you begin? The man whose death sparked the Arab revolt is a guy named Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam. Well, Hamas's armed wing today are the Qassam brigades, their terrorist wing that carried out the atrocities of October 7th. The arguments of this period about demography and about a majority, there are many things about this conflict that are very complex, but I think there are some that are really quite simple. I think it's been said that demography is destiny. I forget exactly who said that, but in many ways the conflict, I think, boils down to who's got 51% between the river and the sea, or between whatever borders they're aiming for. Then as now, the Arabs could see that Jews were pouring in. They were fleeing anti-Semitism in Europe, and they could see that if things continued this way, the Jews would be a majority before long. In so many ways, this is the period in which you see the first two-state solution put on the table by the British in the famous Peel Plan. And so in so many ways, so much has changed from this period, but in so many other ways, so much remains exactly the same.
But you also humanize those.
Sorry, I totally didn't answer your question at all.
That's great. That's giving us the gist of.
I'm happy to actually answer your question. I really tried to tell the book. It may sound a bit cliche, but I tried to tell it through human beings, through individuals on all three sides, because this is a triangle in this period. We like to think about the Jewish-Arab conflict, the Israeli-Arab conflict, but there was a third side in this period, that's the British, and I tried to take a few, this whole period, the kind of pre-state period, if we're talking from an Israeli perspective, is just full of so many complex, compelling, eccentric, strange, maddening characters. And so I really tried to take a handful of characters from each side and to tell the story to really reveal momentous historical developments through human beings. And on the Palestinian side, on the Arab side, of course, you can't tell this story without talking about the Mufti, but there are also people like, there's a man named Musa Alami who I think readers have really connected to in this book, and this was a man who was probably the first Palestinian Arab, and I use that terminology simply because it was the terminology of the time instead of saying just plain Palestinian. He was the first Arab of Palestine to attend Cambridge. He was a brilliant man by all accounts, and he was a committed Arab nationalist, full stop. But he had many friendships across the aisle among the Jews, among the British, and one of his long-standing friendships was with none other than David Ben-Gurion, who even in this period is kind of the leading Jew in Mandate Palestine, in the land of Israel. And they have these meetings throughout the mid-30s in which sometimes they meet at Alami's home, sometimes they meet at Ben-Gurion's, and they really try, despite their diametrically opposed political aspirations, and this gets back to one of these kind of crossroads, that roads not taken, despite their diametrically opposed political aspirations, they meet in an atmosphere of respect and even warmth. They remain in contact in one way or another until Ben-Gurion dies in 1973, and they really try to reach a modus vivendi. They fail for various reasons, which I won't tell you because then you won't read the book. But it's really,
even if you knew, you can't read the book.
But it's still worth it, yeah.
But there were real attempts at finding a solution.
So you were talking about Alami and Ben-Gurion. So really, those who could have lived side by side and reject any kind of dialogue or having difficult conversations, which is and coming from someone who has to experience life on campus is really something that we're all suffering from. But I'd like to, and again, like I know that he's probably.
Let's hear a bit more about that, Clemence.
Well, I'm like the moderator. I'm here to hear your perspectives. But so going back to again this figure who was so important, maybe more important for the diaspora, and that's also another question. I mean, like what the diaspora likes and what Israelis, how Israelis fancy themselves or imagine themselves is sometimes, two different propositions. But I like to go back to Amos Oz, and in A Tale of Love and Darkness, talks about his youth, his youth, and he was living in the same neighborhood as Sari Nusseibeh, and who's, I think, 10 years older, because he was born in 1949. And so there are two memoirs. Once Upon a Land, the memoir, Sari Nusseibeh's memoir, came out in 2007, and the two of them realized that their path never crossed.
Right.
So how do you, as Israeli, it's also, easy somehow to not engage, not have, paths don't cross necessarily, and even less so now. So how does one sort of strive towards this, and especially at a time of heightened tensions and obviously grief and mourning on both sides? That's a question for both of you, and how as journalists you can foster this kind of encounters.
Yeah, well, to build on Oren's last answer, I also, in my academic research, I've just completed a research, hopefully, I'm preempting the book launch in 2057, or however long it will take me to complete the manuscript.
Let's find a date on the calendar.
Yeah, about the early history of the Jerusalem Post newspaper, when it was still called the Palestine Post, in the 1930s and 1940s. So just the late mandate period and the very early statehood period. And first of all, when Oren said that Palestinians is a modern term, it's true, because when you, especially in English, back then when you said Palestinians, you meant 99% of the times you meant Jews, the Zionist Jews. So the Palestine Post was a Jewish newspaper, and it was still the Palestine Post. But that's maybe a linguistic side note. And also, so part of my research was really looking at how the founding editor Gershon Agron, who was later the mayor of Jerusalem. There's a street named after him, some of you may know. Was an American journalist who, a devout Zionist, who came to Palestine in the 1920s and then decided to set up this newspaper to try and bridge the gap. Mainly with the British, because he sensed in the aftermath of 1929 that things aren't going the way he wanted them to go. But also, at least initially, in the 1930s, and the revolt is actually the turning point there, he was trying to also accommodate some of the Arab views. And after the revolt, they give up. The revolt and the white paper. I mean, they have bigger fish to fry. So really, you can see very much a concerted effort on the pages of the editorial pages of the Palestine Post, trying to reach out to the Arabs and be in dialogue with them, because you come to think of it, an English language newspaper was probably the only platform that educated, of course, Jews and Arabs could communicate, because they had the common language. So there were plenty of educated Arabs who read the Palestine Post just to have an insight into what the Jews were thinking, and also wrote in and contributed, and Agron and his fellows welcomed those contributions to see, so that, in many ways, so that they can polemicize with them and be in dialogue with them. And on the surface, it's a very good thing, but it was always from, I wouldn't say a disingenuous place, but it was like, I think they weren't really in dialogue with them. It was some sort of like a tug of war that, and it continues to this day, that you can see the way that many Israeli leftists reach out to the Palestinians, and many moderate Palestinians reach out to Israelis. It's always on their terms. So it's sort of like maybe a very complex and intricate zero-sum game, but it's still a zero-sum game. And I think that we should.
So how do you break this?
Yeah, yeah. So I think that really I mean, it's almost it's a cliche now, but really trying to say I think that more and more people are convinced. At the end of the day, there is give or take. A realization on both sides that no one's going anywhere, and it's just that I think a lot of community work to say that it's not a zero-sum game, and I think it's worked pretty well so far with bridging gaps between Israelis and Jews and Arabs within Israel. If you compare the two breaking points, the riots of 2000 compared to the riots of 2021. The riots of 2000 were the aftermath. That was a terrible break between Jews and Arabs. I mean, that it almost brought the Arab sector to bankruptcy, because there were many Jewish businesses were lost. And in 2021, it took a lot less time to bounce back. And also, another thing is that 2 months later, after these riots of 2021, the sectarian violence within Israel, an Arab party was admitted to government for the first time in Israel's history. So there was always these two opposing forces pulling in different directions. And again, maybe a broken record here, but it's really the role of a responsible leadership to make sure that things are going, at least to try and push things in the right direction. And the leadership right now is anything but responsible.
So, speaking of each side approaching the other on its own terms, there was a newspaper in the mandate period that was put out by the Histadrut, the Zionist Labor Federation, an Arabic paper, and it was called Hakikat al-Amr, which means the truth of the matter, rather self-assuredly. And I wonder how many Arabs read that paper. Presumably very few. So Gilad, you and I should do a mandate event, British mandate event, and I think the number of people who would come to that event would be roughly the readership of Hakikat al-Amr. Yeah.
Probably, yeah.
I think we're nearing the end of our time before questions. I have multiple questions still, but two things. We've talked about the complexity of Israel, the way in which, Israel, we're talking about multiple lands in one. Do you think that when you're hearing that anti-Zionism, chanting, etc., are we talking, is it even fair to talk about Zionism, or do you think that Zionism's plural is actually what describes, captures what's going on right now, even more than ever?
Well, there was an article today at the former workplace of both Gilad and me, Haaretz newspaper. There was an article or a tweet today by Linda Dayan in which she asked, okay, can we just define, she asked the Twitter sphere, can we just define what we mean by Zionism? Do we mean Kahanist? Do we mean someone who believes in a two-state solution? Do we just, is it just someone with, exactly, a cultural Zionist? Is it someone just with a Jewish last name? She wrote, I'd be keen to know. And I think that's a fair question at this point. Sometimes it seems that all of these seem to get increasingly muddled together, and it does seem that Zionist increasingly just means, it means Israeli, certainly, but it seems to mean Jew increasingly. Clemence, I'm not going to let you hide behind the moderator screen. I want to hear a little bit about... Usually I'm the one hiding behind the historian screen, but so I do think the Z word has just become...
Gen Z could also be Generation Zionist, but what kind of Zionist are we talking about? And at this point, Gen Z is anything, doesn't seem to be exactly Generation Zionist, but...
No, I wouldn't let you off the hook either, but I will just say briefly that I think it was Amos Oz who said that Zionism is a family name, and that you can choose your first name, right? Whether it's revisionist or labor Zionist or religious Zionist or whatever. And
what about anti-Zionist? Are you still in the family?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm going to say. That it's become, on both sides, so weaponized that the question isn't really not whether you're a Zionist or anti-Zionist, but really what your prospects are for the future of the land. And I think that you can see, actually increasingly so in America, among Jewish Americans right now, the growth of non or even rabidly anti-Zionist discourse. And what I think it needs to be done is to look at these ideas not from the point of view of whether they are Zionist or not, according to your view, but whether their views are humanistic or not. So there could be some anti-Zionist. For many Israelis, and I think that many Zionists in the diaspora as well, anti-Zionist means one thing, genocidal ideology. Rid the Jews, either kill them or expel them, and make Palestine this Jew-free, nationalist, maybe even Islamic country. And I think it misses the point and really dumbs down the debate to a very, very great extent. And it shouldn't be so, because what it creates, and I'm looking at the Jewish community, like diaspora Jews mainly, I do care about non-Jews, but not so much in that extent. I don't expect non-Jews to be Zionist or to have anything to do with Zionism. But what it really does is, as Peter Beinart has said for a long time, it coerces Jewish Americans to choose between the Zionism and their other values. And there needs to be another way, and I think it's absolutely possible. And there are routes for it, again, being created in Israel, that we are also trying to give a platform to them on the pages of the Tel Aviv Review of Books, of how to think about alternatives to classical Zionism that is not immediately branded as genocidal or negationist or what have you.
I mean, the late Vivian Silver, who was killed on October 7th, talked about conditional Zionism.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
I like that. Yeah, she said she was just to say she was a peace activist from Kibbutz Be'eri, just outside Gaza, that was raided on the 7th of October, and she herself was killed brutally. It took I think 30-something days to identify her body. And she was an outspoken and very active, very devoted peace activist, and she called herself a conditional Zionist. She said, I'm a Zionist as long as the rights of the Palestinians are not denied. And I like that because it really has this very fluid, rather than dogmatic view of politics, it's something you can play around with, and I think it's good for politics because politics is really, as I said, adapting.
Yeah, right. Not signing a blank check.
Exactly.
Which or being entrenched or embattled in so many ways, which we're all suffering from at this point. I also wanted to. I think I'll close, and then I have a few cards. If you still want to write me a postcard, this is your time, and I'll share with my partners in crime. But crises are also opportunities. It's impossible to ignore the death toll, the number of deaths growing, and the hostages who may or may not come back alive. What do you see? Is there? Silver lining is probably the wrong word, but what do you see as something that would create hope, or maybe a different, break this narrative and the cycle of violence? I mean, this is what tragedy is about, right? But tragedies are also, in Greek theater, are a way to, create a cathartic experience and try to break the cycle of violence.
It's dead like that.
Maybe. Thank you. Maybe that's a sign that it's for me. I won't lie. It's very, very, very difficult to be optimistic in these times. I think, as Gilad mentioned earlier, the kind of silver lining. It's more than a silver lining. Israelis really have come together in a spirit of solidarity that's really been quite moving to see. I think this government has. I think the vast majority of Israelis, I believe, would agree and do agree in polls that this government has not functioned as it should. It arguably wasn't functioning at all in the immediate aftermath of the October 7th attacks. The government was absent. I'm not trying to get political here, but this is my feeling, and I think that of most Israelis. And in that vacuum, regular Israelis just stepped into the void in just this amazing grassroots effort in a moment of, and we're still in a moment of tremendous trauma, but really when, pardon the when the blood was still wet, pardon the grim metaphor, but really Israelis just made it happen. They brought food to soldiers, they brought clothing, they brought collected toys for kids who had been evacuated. And so in those first few weeks and months when we were all grieving and shocked, I think that I really found that very, very moving and very encouraging. So that gives me a bit of hope as far as Israel is concerned. As far as
Gaza.
What? Sorry.
As far as Gaza.
For me, it's very difficult to be optimistic in terms of Gaza's future, and in terms of, to be quite honest, in terms of a final status agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. I think there's room for optimism regionally speaking. I think the Abraham Accords have been just a tremendous sea change. I was not remotely a fan of Donald Trump or Jared Kushner, but I think
we have a question about him coming up.
But I think it was. I didn't expect to see such a warm peace between Israel and any Arab country in my lifetime as what we see with the UAE and Bahrain to an extent, Morocco to a certain extent. And so it's not all bad in the region at all. But when it comes to the prospect of an Israeli-Palestinian accord, if it happens, I suspect it'll be the very last accord that Israel reaches with its Arab neighbors. I think there's, it'll be after all of the other dominoes fall. I think in many ways, you spoke about the late Vivian Silver's concept of conditional Zionism, but I sometimes, I often wonder if the two national movements' aspirations are not mutually exclusive, if they're not at the end of the day fighting over the same thing, or at least if there isn't perhaps a critical mass perhaps on both sides that ultimately want the same thing, and namely Tel Aviv, Jaffa, Haifa, Jerusalem, and so. Yeah, so it's. I'm sorry for that bleak diagnosis, but I think, yeah, that's how I see things.
So if you want a bit of optimism, I think, and it may sound very counterintuitive, that we're a much better place now than we were 2 years ago, because the status quo that has guided us for a fair few years and was the marker of Netanyahu's reign is now gone, and that is that you can sweep the Palestinian issue under the carpet and everything will continue to be hunky-dory. The high-tech sector will continue to boom. There will be tourists pouring in for the Tel Aviv Pride Parade every year, and why bother about the Palestinians? We don't care. Nobody cares about them anymore. And we have seen, and I hate to be one of those who said, but we tried to tell you, but I think there were many people in Israel who were trying to say that and were also dismissed, that the Palestinian issue and the Gaza issue would blow up in our faces at some point. Now, I don't think anyone expected it to be so bad and so bloody and so shocking, but it was. And what it means now is that Israel has come to a T-crossing. You can either turn right towards another Nakba, right, towards genocide or expulsion or very brutal treatment of the Palestinians, or to turn towards some sort of arrangement with them that would, what's really the best way to prevent another 7th of October? It's either that or an arrangement, a two-state solution, I think, is the umbrella term, but it's something that would enable the Israelis and Palestinians to come to terms. Now, I think that the two-state solution is, first of all, of course, much more moral than another Nakba, and of course, and also I think it's more feasible. And I think it also the 7th of October, Oren was talking about the regional repercussions of it. It really jolted many of Israel's friends in the region and in the world, and I'm talking about Jordan, Egypt, and other influential players, of course, Europe and the White House, into knowing that there needs to be a much more interventionist approach to the Israeli-Palestinian issue than before. Now, whether they'll follow through on this or not remains to be seen. Whether Biden will win the election or not, and will be able to pursue that.
Freudian slip.
Freudian slip.
Yes,
you're already invisioning,
exactly,
inhabiting a second Trump.
Who knows?
Right. I mean, speaking of that, that's a perfect unintended segue, because you hadn't seen the cards, but this is. It's not what's in the cards, but this is what the card reads. Speaking of unusual characters, what do you think will happen if Trump gets elected?
For this country or for the Middle East? How much time do we have?
I guess it's for the Middle East. And remarkably, in the Abraham Accords, there was nothing about the Palestinians. I mean, this is one of the striking features of a regional accord that completely ignored the Palestinians.
Right. So, what does a second Trump presidency mean for the Middle East? I think the answer to that partially depends on who's Prime Minister of Israel. By all accounts, Bibi Netanyahu's popularity is at an all-time low. We shall see. What was that gesture, sir? Was that a? I thought I saw a thumbs down. And so his political future is not at all clear. Trump and Netanyahu were, of course, very closely aligned during the first Trump presidency, hopefully the last. But of course, they've had a bit of a falling out, haven't they? Netanyahu had the temerity to congratulate President Biden when he was elected, an unpardonable offense for President Trump. And so Trump has said some very negative things about Netanyahu since. Yeah.
And positive things about Hezbollah. Remember that they were very smart.
I mean, I laugh, but he essentially said that Hamas wouldn't have done what it did had he been in power. So I'll just let that sit there for a moment. So I think I don't think the Trump-Netanyahu relationship, if Trump were to return to power and Netanyahu were to retain power, I just don't see it being the same. I think Trump would be much more reluctant to give that kind of fulsome support to Israel that he gave before, and not to mention Trump's rather interesting relationship with Vladimir Putin could very much complicate matters, given that Putin has essentially thrown his lot in with Hamas, in my view. And so, I rather shudder to think, is my answer.
I would just say briefly that the one thing that I was thankful for on the 7th of October was that Trump wasn't in office. Because I could pretty much safely say that we would have been in a regional war already. That Hezbollah would have joined in, and maybe other players guided by Iran and Israel's retaliation. Israelis were so shocked on the 7th of October that I think it really muddied their judgment. So the retaliation could have been a lot worse than it was if Israel felt that it stood alone, and thanks to Biden and other European leaders, it did not feel that it was standing alone. And I think that really this is the thing that really freaks me out the most about the prospect of Biden again, a Freudian sleep, of Trump getting elected.
Your sympathies are clear.
Yeah.
Gilad, 2 slips and 2 answers.
I'm still a bit jet lagged.
All right, so I have a few questions that go back to Oren's book, but one is really written in tiny script, and it's almost a postcard. I really love it. But so I'll read most of it. Israel is heir to a heritage of Jews who, for the most part, remain separate from the communities around them, preserving their traditions while at the same time weaving aspects of their communities into their culture. In your view, has this tension between preserving heritage and exchanging culture been a roadblock or learning opportunity for Israel on the path to preserving its Jewish identity and maintaining a liberal democracy representing all citizens, Jewish and non-Jewish? It was well worth reading it.
It looks like calligraphy. So the question is sort of, okay, here we go. The kind of blending between, a more isolated culture versus more universal values, is that kind of?
Or integrating into Middle Eastern culture.
Preserving its Jewish identity and maintaining a liberal democracy, right. So I think, I think in many ways, at least, the founders of Israel were really, in many ways, they were massively influenced by European culture and by liberal sort of Enlightenment values and by socialist values and by European nationalism. At the same time, they tried to sort of channel the Jewish inheritance oftentimes in a sort of secularized form, but certainly Ben-Gurion, for example, was a huge fan of the prophetic books, the Jewish ethical tradition, even though he dabbled quite heavily in atheism in certain years, but he was quite dynamic on that. There were points in which he identified as an atheist. I think he wrote down on a form at a certain point he identified as an atheist, but then he kind of...
I'm an atheist, thank God, kind of moment.
But then he found a certain sort of Eastern-infused spirituality later on. So it was an interesting journey. But certainly the kind of ethical precepts of the Tanakh, of the Jewish prophets were very important to Ben-Gurion and other early Zionists. So yeah, so I think certainly I think it's safe to say that in the intervening decades, the liberal democratic values upon which Israel was very proud to have been founded have in recent years perhaps taken a bit of a backseat to the more Jewish religious inheritance. I think if you look at the past few governments of Israel, this is a simplification, but I think the trajectory, you could argue the trajectory is in that direction. And when you look at this government, I think it's hard to argue otherwise. This is, as Gilad mentioned, this is the most extreme right-wing government Israel has ever had.
You could even argue it started in 1967 with
absolutely. That was really when religion really came back with full force and really reasserted itself after being somewhat. These are all simplifications, but after having been rather dormant for the first 20 years of Israel's life. And so, yeah, so I hope that answers the question in that I think it's a fair assessment to say that, yes, there are certainly prominent influential members of this government and some of the previous governments for whom the Jewish inheritance, the Jewish tradition, are simply far more important than liberal democratic values, and the Jewish part of Jewish and democratic state trumps, no pun intended, the democratic part. Yeah, I hope that's answered the question.
Yeah, I think it does. Or if that's not the case, then the person should just stand up.
Well, I guess I'm talking mostly about the Jewish religious tradition, which, you know, the Jewish, again, broadly speaking, the Jewish religious tradition, halakha, studying Talmud, the Jewish, the more observant. Yes, a more Jewish, a more religious way of life, as opposed to one that is more infused with liberal democratic values. Now, of course, it's been argued many times by very many intelligent people that those two can coexist quite well. But I think, again, in this particular government and the last few governments, there have been a lot of people who I think aren't all that interested necessarily in the liberal democratic side of that coin.
Well, and the backsliding also was the citizenship law that contains elements that would have been banned a few years ago. I mean, the Kach party was, promoted a certain two-tiered vision of citizenship, and it was banned in 1989, I believe. Right. So there's some, aspects that were more fringe that have become mainstream or part of the government as well. Correct.
There are people serving in key cabinet posts now who a few years ago it would have been unconscionable. It would be as impossible as a Trump presidency was just a year or two before it happened. So
any want to weigh in on this?
No, let's continue.
Okay. All right, so I have two more questions that I'll merge. So what was the range of fast backwards, what was the range of attitudes of Arabs towards Jews in 1936-39, the street Arab versus the leadership, so this idea of the lay people versus leadership that we find versions of today. And can you elaborate about the collapse of the Arab revolts and intra-Arab violence?
So I think I spoke earlier about demographics, and I think really in many ways there's a quote in my book from a prominent Arab very early after the Balfour Declaration, the early 20s, in which it's this prominent Arab, the mayor of Jerusalem actually, talking to a leading Zionist, and he says, "We are not against the Jews. We, on the contrary, the Jews are like salt in bread. You need a little bit of it's an energetic force. It's a fermenting force. This is a good thing. The problem is the numbers, right? Too much salt and you ruin the loaf, right?" And this leading Zionist says, "Well, you've got it all wrong. We don't want to be the salt. We want to be the bread." and so that's, I think, in many ways, it was again fundamentally a question of numbers. In the early 20s, when the mandate began, it was clear that the arrival of the Jews and their British imperial midwives, facilitators, were bringing tremendous material gain to the land. I mean, this was a land that was transformed. Even critics of Zionism very often had to acknowledge the fact that the land was transformed in the 20s. From a backwater of a failing, declining Ottoman Empire to, as another prominent Arab in my book, the editor of Philistine newspaper put it, this corner of Europe that has been established so quickly in Palestine. And so the economic gains, the gains in healthcare, clearing the swamps, all of these things that we've heard about in Hebrew school, the land was transformed. Whether those material gains reached every Arab farmer is debatable, but the land itself was transformed. And so that was kind of undeniable. But once Hitler comes to power in January 1933, and other anti-Semitic movements are on the ascendant in Poland and Hungary and Romania in the mid-30s, the Jewish immigration doubles. The Jewish population of Palestine doubles, from in the first half of the 1930s. The population of Tel Aviv triples. Land sales double. And so 60,000 Jews came to Mandate Palestine in 1935. That's double the figure of 2 years before. And I think 4 years before, it was something like 4,000 or 5,000. So it was really very dramatic growth. And the Arabs could see not just the more educated elites in the cities, but even subsistence farmers who were very often illiterate were perceptive enough to recognize that if things continued this way, the Jews would be a majority before long. And that's really the backdrop to this revolt, is this idea that we have to do something, we Arabs, before we're a minority in our own country.
Thank you. Any other question? I think I saw. Okay, I think we're out of time and out of cards. So
are we out of cards?
We are. So
let's end on some kind of optimistic, forward-looking note. Gilad, take it away.
Yeah, all right. Wow.
No, I was just going to say about, you mentioned the editor of Palestine, the newspaper. So going back to what I said earlier about the Palestine Post's attempt to reach out to the Arab community as well and be like an all-Palestinian publication. Did you mean, was it Yusuf Hana that you, Yusuf Hana? So Yusuf Hana, the editor of Palestine, was the Jaffa correspondent of the Palestine Post for a few years up until 1936, when it was no longer possible. So I think that, essentially, I don't know if it's like a note to end on, but I think essentially there are and there always have been, in 1934 and in 2024, there have been quite pervasive manifestations of this willingness to reach out again on their own terms. But I think that the flame has not yet been put out. And our work as, I don't know, intellectuals or activists or leaders or whatever is really to make sure that it's not put out.
And we're in a synagogue with an Ner Tamid, so the eternal flame. So
Amen.
Thank you so much, Gilad and Oren, for this wonderful conversation. And with this,
thank you so much. We're so grateful for this conversation, and And I think one of the things that sometimes American Jews and Americans in particular don't have an insight into the kind of debate that happens in Israel, which the Tel Aviv Review of Books is trying to give us some insight, I think, which is a great launch to the series that we're doing, which is primarily going to be on Zoom with folks in Israel. And so I just want to give a preview of this incredible series that Helena is supporting in memory of her parents and in honor of Yom HaAtzmaut, that the next stop in the series is on April 17th, next Wednesday at 12:30, with Rachel Korazim, who's a teacher of poetry, and there's been a huge amount of poetry that's been written post-October 7th, and so she's going to be teaching these poems, which speak, I think, to the experience of primarily Israeli Jews post-October 7th, and she's an incredible teacher, and the poetry is really riveting. We learned with her in Israel when we brought the trip there. The next session after that is actually with Achim Laneshech and Bonot Alternativa, who are two of the main pro-democracy groups that have been highlighted across Israel, and of course also in America, that morphed on October 7th for pro-democracy into really being the response since the government was absent. And so two of the leaders in those movements will be speaking to on May 8th, and then May 15th we're going to be speaking to Avi Dabush, who's the head executive director of Rabbis for Human Rights. He was on Kibbutz Nirim on October 7th, which is one of the kibbutzim. He's a survivor of the attack. That was actually a kibbutz that we visited on our trip as well. And he's also, for anyone who follows him, he's basically written every day since October 7th and has ended all his posts with Ani Ma'amim, I still believe. And so I'm going to take in some way Oren's gift to us, which is, I think there is a lot of, actually Gilad is Gilad's gift. I think sobering news is important, and also it's important to know that there are people who are still holding out hope. And so we have to kind of hold both at the same time. And I think through this series we'll get to be exposed to different opinions, different places in Israeli society, and hope that we as American Jews have a greater insight into the lived experience of Israelis. Also, our hope over time, we're in conversation with also some Arab Israelis as well, which we're hoping to add to the series. So thank you very much for being with us, and for those who are online, and you can still purchase the book, Oren's book, in the back, and we hope everyone will have a beautiful night. Thank you. And subscribe to the Tel Aviv Review of Books. And you can pick up the copies in the back. Thank you so much.